Who were the first Americans? That is a question that has been plaguing scientists for hundreds of years. It's a question that we think we have an answer to, but new discoveries are constantly coming along that cast doubt on our previous understanding of just how humans populated the Americas. Hi, it's me, and this is my channel, and today we're going to look at who the first Americans really were. When we think of ancient migration patterns, we usually think of our distant ancestors trudging across continents in search of better hunting grounds or fleeing from some great disaster in their homeland. And while these things did play a role in the settlement of the Americas, the reality was a lot more complex than that. For most of human history, it was generally accepted that humans migrated into North America via the Bering Land Bridge, a swath of exposed land that connected eastern Siberia and Alaska during the last ice age. This idea was based on the fact that the genetic and cultural similarities between Native American and Siberian populations were too great to be merely coincidental. In other words, they couldn't have just showed up out of nowhere. But those similarities could also be explained if their ancestors had come across the Bering Land Bridge and then moved south. In 2008, however, that long-held belief received a huge blow when a team of archaeologists discovered the oldest undisputed human footprints in North America. These prints were found in New Mexico's White Sands National Park, which isn't anywhere near the proposed migration route through Alaska. But that's not all. The tracks date back around 23,000 years before the end of the Ice Age, which means that there would have been no Bering Land Bridge for our ancestors to walk across. So then, the question becomes, how did they get here? The current research consensus seems to be that our ancestors actually arrived in multiple waves. The first small group arrived somewhere around 30,000 years ago, probably by boat, and made their way down the coast. We don't know exactly where they came from, but genetic studies suggest that they may have traveled from what is now northern Japan. From here, they spread out across the continent, eventually reaching Mexico. Unfortunately, very little physical evidence of this first wave has survived, and so most of what we know about them comes from genetic studies and comparisons with contemporary cultures from around the world. We do have some clues as to how they lived, however. For example, genomic research suggests that the first Americans were hunter-gatherers who relied on wild plants as a food source. This contrasts sharply with the later Native American cultures that we've studied, which tended to focus on hunting large game and which had very few wild plants in their diet. This tells us that early human life in the Americas was actually quite different from what we typically imagine. The coastal migration theory also goes a long way to explaining some of the similarities between Native American and Japanese cultures, such as similarities in mythology and in artistic styles. Some scholars even believe that the dog, which was domesticated somewhere in East Asia, was brought to the Americas by these early migrants. However, it should be noted that this isn't universally agreed upon. Regardless, this first culture didn't stick around for long. For reasons that we don't understand, they disappeared sometime around 14,000 years ago. Then, about 10,000 years later, a second wave of migrants arrived in North America. This group is who we associate with the beginning of Native American culture, the Clovis culture. But wait, if the first Americans arrived 30,000 years ago, why do we call the Clovis people the first Native Americans? Well, the term Native American is often used to refer to anyone who descends from the indigenous peoples of the Americas. And the Clovis culture is the oldest culture that we've discovered that fits that description. So while they weren't the first humans in North America, they were the first humans in North America whose descendants remained here permanently. These people are believed to have come from the same general area as the first Americans, somewhere in Northeast Asia. But instead of traveling down the coast, the Clovis people headed inland. Their name actually comes from the type site for their culture, which is a location in New Mexico's Blackwater Canyon. Here, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a massive bison hunt that took place around 13,000 years ago. This kill site contained thousands of bones from young bison, many of which displayed distinctive butchering marks. But perhaps even more interesting were the projectile points that were discovered nearby. These finely crafted spear points are known as Clovis points and are easily identifiable thanks to their fluted design. But that's not to say that everyone agrees on exactly what the Clovis culture was. There's been a lot of debate over whether the Clovis culture should be considered a single culture, or whether it was simply a designation given to a wide variety of geographically separated groups who shared certain traits. The argument for the latter is bolstered by the fact that Clovis points have been found as far south as Mexico and as far north as Canada, a huge area for a single culture. What makes this question difficult to answer is that the Clovis culture was entirely nomadic. They never settled in one place for too long, and they left behind few material remains besides tools and weapons. To complicate matters further, traditional dating methods can't always tell us how long these various groups were around. This is because the Clovis culture thrived during the Younger Dryas, a period of rapid climate change that lasted from about 12,900 to 11,700 years ago. During this time, the planet went from being mostly ice-free to experiencing another ice age in a matter of decades. This dramatic shift in climate led to the extinction of many megafauna species, including North America's megafauna, and forced the surviving humans to adopt a new way of life. It was this drastic change that likely led to the end of the Clovis culture, and ultimately gave rise to the various Native American tribes that we're familiar with today. However, new techniques in archaeology and genetics have allowed researchers to re-examine previously unearthed artifacts and gain a new perspective on the Clovis culture. Take the Cactus Hill site in Virginia, for instance. Here, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a hearth structure that had been dated to around 14,500 years ago. But a recent study found that the age of this structure was closer to 18,500 years ago, making it nearly 2,000 years older than the Clovis culture. And that's not all. The bones recovered from the site didn't contain any trace of domestic livestock or crops, which suggests that the people who lived here were still practicing a hunter-gatherer lifestyle and were thus likely part of the earlier Paleoamerican culture. This discovery calls into question the idea that the Clovis culture was the first true Native American culture, and raises the possibility that there were other cultures before them that we've yet to discover. As technology improves, we can expect to learn more about the early inhabitants of North America. We may find that the first Americans arrived in multiple waves, or perhaps that there were even more early cultures than we thought. One thing is for sure, though, the story of the first Americans is a lot more complex than we once believed, and will continue to be rewritten as new discoveries come to light. What do you think? How do you think the first Americans ended up in North America? And do you think there were even more cultures that existed before the Clovis culture? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.